So you were born in Brazil, and you started. You discovered Jung in a bookshop in a
Yeah,
German bookshop, right?
yeah. I was a kid.
Well, how old were you then,
Ooh,
approximately?
12, 13?
Right.
No, no, it was before my father died. So I was maximum 12.
All right.
Yeah,
Do
quite
you
young.
remember? Do you remember what struck you in that foreword to the I Ching? Why it's just
Y- No, I was a kid. It's hard to really recover that mindset and put myself back there. But my memory is that when I picked up that book and I looked at it, the I Ching, and my first reaction to it was that it's some esoteric
yeah.
fiction or fantasy, not something to take seriously. Um, there were lots of funny figures in the book, which I now understand why they were. But when I was a kid, it was like, what is this? Some kind of oracle? And for some reason, I started reading the first paragraphs of the foreword by Jung.
Hmm.
And what struck me is that he wrote as a rationalist, a very intuitive rationalist, but a rationalist nonetheless. And in the way he talked about that book, sort of opened up space for a rational relationship with the book that nonetheless took the book seriously, that didn't dismiss the book. So he made me see that there were rational hypotheses on the basis of which we could contemplate uh, what is essentially an oracle in a serious way, as a hypothesis that may hold some water. It's highly speculative, but it's not nonsense. It's not completely debased. And that's what struck me, that Jung managed to open that door in my mind, that there was more that was amenable to rational interpretation than I initially thought.
Right. And then you were mostly in computers, and I'd really like to. That would be very. I mean, we have an hour, so we can't go into great detail. But your trajectory from into computer science and then back to Jung. That's we have readers with a rather technocratic mindset, so that could help to establish your credentials
Yeah.
there.
Well, I went to computer engineering school. I had just turned 17 years old. And I grew up in the early days of the home computer revolution. And I touched my first home computer. I was like 60 years old. It was a ZX81, or yeah, I was still 6 years old, I think. And I thought those things were wonderful, and I wanted to build my own bespoke home computer. And so I went to computer engineering school at university. I was just 17. Um, and then, as soon as I graduated, I landed at CERN in Switzerland, working with the big accelerator. I was part of the data acquisition team of the Atlas experiment, which is part of the Large Hadron Collider, one of the two big experiments that have discovered the Higgs boson about 10 years ago. Um, and all that side of me that had to do with Jung, had to do with this sort of edifying speculations about the nature of mind and then the nature of reality. All of that took a backseat from the time I was 17 into the beginning of my career, because I was in a sort of a professional whirlwind. I loved what I did. If you don't mind me saying that, I was good at what I was good at what I did, even though I was very young. But then at CERN, although we were building data acquisition systems based on classical algorithms, based on a human understanding of the physics, in parallel, we were doing in our own time an alternative, an equivalent data acquisition system based on artificial neuronal networks,
Mm.
so AI. And although it was not adopted, because back in the 90s, neural networks were still sort of a black box. They worked, but nobody understood quite what they were doing or why they worked. So people didn't trust them, and they were not powerful enough. So it was never used. But in our own experiments, we realized that a neural network is just as good as the classical algorithm that's based on human intelligence, human understanding. And then the question came to me, if I can make a computer that is as intelligent as a physicist, what does it take to make it conscious?
Mm-hmm.
And I struggled with that question for a couple of years until I realized that whatever I would change in my design, whatever I conceivably could change in my design, it would have an impact only on structure and function, and it would bring me no closer or no further from having a reason to consider it conscious. In other words, none of what I did had any bearing on consciousness. It was completely unrelated, incommensurable. And how could that be? That realization forced me to reevaluate my metaphysics, my view of the nature of reality, the nature of mind, retrace my steps in order to figure out when I took a wrong turn that brought me to a dead alley. And I realized that that wrong turn was the assumption that I never examined, that consciousness is something that you can create out of specific material arrangements. One thing is incommensurable with the other, so that assumption was wrong. So I thought, okay, what does it take then to not make that assumption and still have a rational narrative in terms of which to relate to the world? And that eventually brought me to metaphysical idealism and brought me back to Jung, brought me back to philosophy, which I was very interested in when I was a kid, and eventually brought me to a second doctorate, this time in philosophy, and now 12 books written in philosophy, countless papers and essays. So yeah, it's been a big turn.
Yeah. When was that? When you realized that you have to reevaluate this basic metaphysical assumption?
It was in the early noughties, so between 2000 and 2005. It wasn't one big moment. It sort of spread out in time.
Of course.
I started being suspicious of it at the turn of the century, but I realized it conclusively after 2005. Yeah.
Was there any
And
specific event there which?
no, it was not. There wasn't that seminal moment. It's something that sort
Not a
of.
revelation or anything. It's just like a.
Well, it was a revelation, but
Yeah,
not
but drawn out.
instantaneous, and not instantaneous one. It's something that sort of cooked up in the back of my mind for the longest time, and eventually percolated up to my normal awareness. But by the time it did that, it was very solid. It was a very solid, very reliable insight.
Quite opposite to the ethos of our time, when everybody's talking now about the AI and how it is becoming conscious, if not tomorrow, then day after.
Well, I guess every period in history has its idiocy, and this is the idiocy of the time.
All right. Well, let's switch to Jung then. I like very much the metaphor that you came up with a few of our interviews, and in perhaps not in the book, but Jung as a candle holder in this dark period of positivism and
Behaviorism.
yeah, so it's like a link from German idealism to the current, shall we say, the Western Renaissance in metaphysics.
Yeah, he was very lonely doing that.
Yeah, just let's take first this longer view of history and put Jung into that slot where he belongs and on that great grand scheme.
Well, before the middle of the 19th century, we have always had a relationship with the world that entailed the understanding that behind the things we saw, behind the physical stuff of the world, there was something similar or akin to what is behind our own body. In other words, consciousness. Who chronicled this best was probably I forgot the name of the author. The book is Saving the Appearances. How can I draw a blank now? I will try to remember.
Well, saving the appearance is a phrase that belongs to Plato, isn't it? I mean,
no, it's the title of the.
That's not the book by Plato, but
No, it is a philosopher from the 20th century.
20th.
How can I forget his name? My goodness me.
But the phrase, I think, belongs to Plato, doesn't it?
It could be.
Yeah, but yeah.
But so there was this philosopher who wrote this book, Saving the Appearances, in the middle of the 20th century, and that's the point he makes, that behind the appearances of the world, we have always considered there to be something equivalent to ourselves. In other words, a consciousness behind the appearances. So as there is a consciousness behind this physical body, me, there is a consciousness behind the physical universe. That was how we related to reality, sort of automatically, instinctively, for the longest of times. Even after the Enlightenment, the founders of the Enlightenment knew that materialism was just a weapon to be used against the church for political and power reasons. It was not proper metaphysics. Denis Diderot's own record saying materialism doesn't really work, but we need it as a weapon against the church. He said that, I think, in the 18th century. It was only around the middle of the 19th century when Hegelian idealism no longer was mainstream in Europe. It lost its traction. Hegelianism became sort of transmuted into Marxism around that time. And then there was, On the Origin of the Species by Darwin, which robbed religion out of its very last power, which is the power to create life. We forgot that materialism was a political tool, and we started actually believing wholesale that mind either doesn't exist or doesn't matter. And by the early 20th century, we had logical positivism, the incredibly naive and fallacious notion that only the things you can perceive exist. It's like, what? Why would a monkey have evolved a perceptual apparatus that is able to capture every salient aspect of nature? There's absolutely no reason why we would have evolved to do that. We evolved to survive, not to have a complete understanding of the cosmos and nature in all its saliences. And then behaviorism, which basically eliminated consciousness, mind, from the scientific dialogue. It basically said mind only exists insofar as its visible behavior. It tries to reduce mind to its behavior, which is ridiculous. For there to be behavior, something needs to behave. Something needs to have the impetus, the motivation for the behavior. And we all know our own minds from within. We know that we are minded even when we lie inert, without moving, without behaving. We know that there is still mental inner life. So how we fell into that black hole of downright stupidity, it's unfathomable. And Jung held the candle during the first half of the 20th century by insisting on what Jungian psychologists today call the reality of the psyche. And his point to modern ears, to contemporary ears now, to you and me, is incredibly self-evident. It's a tautology. Why did he need to say that? Because what he said was that experience is a real natural event. Experience is not nothing. Even when experiences are illusory, they don't correspond to outside facts. Even then, the fact that you have an illusion is an event in nature. It's not the same as not having the illusion. The illusion itself is real as such, as an illusion. And that's the reality of the psyche. Mental events are real as such, as mental events. And that's like obvious, who would question that? But yes, in those dark times of behaviorism, people actually somehow questioned that. The mind was dismissed as a sort of non-existent. those were those are very dark times. And Jung held the candle of light all the way until the beginning of a sort of a counter revolution that would bring us to where we are today, in which we openly debate panpsychism, we openly debate idealism, we openly acknowledge the hard problem of consciousness that is entailed by materialism. And that began in the 60s. Jung died in 61, right? Yeah, 61. Um, that began with the hippies, of all things, with the psychedelic revolution that started in the 50s, but acquired steam and momentum in the 60s, and eventually would lead to a 1974 paper called "What Is It Like to Be a Bat?" which brought back consciousness experience into the scientific debate. And then in the 90s, the whole discussion about panpsychism, which I think is wrong, but it was good that we debated that, to where we are today, which is, idealism is some form of idealism is probably the only plausible alternative we have, based on the experiments in physics that won the Nobel Prize last year, which refuted physical realism, unless one entertains some ridiculous theoretical fantasy. The entire discussion in analytic philosophy that basically renders physicalism untenable. People who still rigorously defend physicalism today, if you talk to them, you realize that what they call physicalism is not materialism at all. It's something else that they still want to put the label physicalism on, but it's more akin to a form of idealism or panpsychism or cosmopsychism than it is to materialism. So materialism is history, and Jung held the light during the most difficult, dangerous, and narrow segment of the path that has brought us here.
Yeah, one thing that I picked up from your book is that well, many things obviously, but that how tight a rope he was threading on.
Yeah.
In his correspondence with Pauly, and that was really fascinating for me. Right. There's a one sentence that I wrote out, and which I ask you to unpack. Causality is to synchronicity as Newtonian physics is to quantum physics. This was, I think, that leads us into the topic that is the key to for this hour, I think.
Well, that arose from the years of discussion that Jung had with Pauly, both in person and via correspondence. Pauly went to Jung because he had psychological difficulties that he had to deal with, but also because strange things happened around him, things that today we would call synchronicity, but Jung hadn't published his book on synchronicity at that moment. So Pauly and Jung were talking about this, and Pauly told Jung that although causality rules in the classical world of tables and chairs, if you zoom into the microscopic, into the quantum world, causality no longer rules, because individual quantum events seem to be random. We can't predict individual quantum events. And of course, everything in nature arises from individual quantum events. And then Jung had this hypothesis that maybe there are two organizing principles in nature. One is causality that applies to tables and chairs. And the other one is synchronicity that applies directly to the microscopic, to the quantum world. And what is synchronicity? Synchronicity is a principle of organization in nature that operates by similarity. Similar things tend to happen together. That similarity doesn't need to be a similarity of appearance. It's rather a similarity of meaning, symbolic meaning, denotation, connotation. And so causality operates through cause leading to effects, and synchronicity operates through the correspondences of meaning. And they would be orthogonal in Jung's hypothesis. And what would open space for synchronicity would be, the seemingly random quantum level events. But of course, after Jung and Pauly fleshed this hypothesis out, they because they were honest and reasonable thinkers, they realized that this classical world of causality, this world of tables and chairs, it is actually a quantum world. Every macroscopic causal event is just the aggregation of myriad microscopic quantum events. So causality cannot be orthogonal to synchronicity. Causality has to be the aggregate result of many synchronicities happening together, such that statistically you can model it in the form of causality. But if the quantum level is synchronistic, then the tables and chairs are also synchronistic, but they are synchronistic in a statistical aggregate way that leads to these higher level patterns and regularities we call cause and effect. But cause and effect should be ultimately reducible to synchronicities, to correspondences of meaning, to similarity, as opposed to causality. And how exactly that happened, of course, they couldn't flesh it out. We haven't fleshed it out to this day. We don't know how, the world of superposed quantum possibilities becomes this definite classical world of tables and chairs. To this day, we don't know that. We know that there is something related to decoherence going on, but even decoherence doesn't really explain this transition. So they just raised this hypothesis that what we call causality is just a statistical aggregate of many, many, many synchronistic events at a microscopic level. So in that sense, Newtonian mechanics, Newtonian physics is also the statistical aggregate of many, many, many quantum events. And that's why the statement in the book that synchronicity is the fundamental reality, and the classical world of cause and effect is just a sort of epiphenomenon of synchronicity, sort of an emergent statistical property of synchronicity, just like temperature is an emergent statistical property of the movement of molecules. So in that way.
Right. The name of Sheldrake already came up in our today's discussion, and I mean he's been a kind of guiding light for me in the last let's say 3, 4, 5 years, perhaps even. How would you see his theory in of morphic resonance in against the background of Jungian metaphysics? He has himself said that he kind of expands the Jungian notion of unconscious and archetypes to the whole nature. So it would be very interesting. It would be what you have to say on that one.
I would maintain that Jung already did it himself in his corpus.
Exactly.
It's very clear that for Jung, what we call the external physical world is just the perceptual manifestation of the collective unconscious. So the collective unconscious is not only within us, really deep inside, but it surrounds us at the same time in the form that we call the physical world. So if the unconscious, if the activity or the behavior of the unconscious unfolds according to this template that we call archetypes, then the physical world is also the embodiment of these archetypes, the expression of these archetypes. And that's why there are synchronicities, a correspondence between an inner psychic event and an outer physical event that happens because both the inner psyche and the outer world are both ultimately the collective unconscious expressing itself. So that notion was already present in Jung. Rupert takes this further. It's not only the original archetypes that were there from the get-go, which are part of what nature is. They are properties, fundamental, intrinsic properties of nature. Not only do those fundamental original templates express themselves in the world, but the way we give expression to them and sort of modify them or clothe them with our own peculiarities, even those habits that we create over time tend to perpetuate themselves. a habit created in the past will bias the probabilities of which events happen today. Events that are consistent with the previous habit will tend to happen with higher probability than events that are not consistent with previous habits.
We are creating archetypes as we go. Is that?
Well, I wouldn't call them archetypes because the word etymologically already refers to something that is intrinsic and immutable.
Okay.
But we create habits.
Oh, yeah.
And habits have a certain momentum, a certain inertia. Once they are set in motion, it sort of opens a path that nature would tend to use afterwards. And that's Rupert's theory of morphic resonance, that habits would tend to bias nature's future behavior along the lines of those habits. And that's why they are habits, because they tend to stick to them. Under physicalism, this is difficult to couch in a formal theoretical way, because under physicalism, the only regularities of nature's behavior are those that are self-consistent. In other words, for instance, take gravity. If you take a book and then in your hand and then you release it, it will always fall down. It will never fall up. It is this consistency that allows us to talk of the laws of nature. But when it comes to habits, by definition, you don't have that consistency. What you have is a statistical bias. But to verify that statistical bias, you have to make so many measurements under so many different circumstances outside the laboratorium, the laboratory, that it is not in practice possible to verify those habits under traditional scientific methods. Under idealism, however, in which the whole world is the expression of mind, that the physical world is just how the behavior of mind presents itself to our observation because of the peculiarities of our perceptual apparatus. If that's how we understand nature, then that nature has habits is incredibly intuitive. We are minded entities and we have habits. We have direct insight into how mind attaches itself to habits, how mind has that inherent disposition to stick to a habit because it makes things easier, it makes things more comfortable, it makes us feel reassured. We have direct psychological insight into that. So we don't need really formal, objective evidence to entertain the hypothesis seriously under idealism. The hypothesis is almost natural. Mind tends to create habits. If nature is a mind, then it will tend to stick to habits.
Right. I mean, how would Bergson fit into that bigger picture that we just what's your take on Bergson?
Well, since we were talking about Rupert, you are probably alluding to mind and matter.
Mind and matter and the creative evolution. First.
Yeah, that's that book. The first one, Mind and Matter, is one of Rupert's greatest influences. I think. I think he talked about that in public at some point.
Yeah, and the creative evolution. Yeah, Bergson in general. Yes, as far as I understand.
Bergson was, to a large extent, an empiricist in the vein of Bishop Berkeley. He would say, what is the world as far as I can know it? It's a collection of images. And what is my body? Well, it's also an image. When he talks about image, what he's talking about is mental content. The world is a set of images. My perceptions, the colors I see, the smells I feel, the textures I feel, the melodies I hear, these are mental events. They are experiences. They are made of qualities. They are not abstract quantities. There is something it is like to see the redness of an apple, to taste a strawberry, or to feel the bitterness of a heartbreak. These are the images that constitute the world as we know it. And we are also images. Images in the mirror, images when you look down. But our image is privileged in a certain sense because the disposition of my image modulates all the other images. In other words, if I turn my head and look back, the other images change. I see what is behind me as opposed to what is in front of me. So we seem to be a privileged image in a world of images. In other words, a mental content in a world of mental content. And that's entirely um, compatible and consistent with idealism. What I think Bergson doesn't do is to account for why the images in your world are consistent with the images in my world.
Mm.
If you were here in my study, you would describe my study in a way very consistent with my own description of it. So there obviously are, well, obviously goes too far because there are serious people in physics today who say that this is not obvious at all. But there seems to be a world beyond ourselves. In other words, there seem to be a set of states that are not part of our own perceptions. They are states out there. They would still be there if we were not around. They do not change just because we wish them to be different. So even though all I can perceive is a collection of my own images, my own perceptions of the world, and your collection of your own images, your own perceptions, because your images are consistent with mine, it seems to be the case that both your images and my images are calibrated by an external set of states in which you and I are immersed.
Mm-hmm.
What is that set? What is the nature of that set? How does the modulation take place? How can we learn something about that set? That set is what Kant called the noumena, as opposed to the phenomenal. So all these questions need a rigorous analytic answer that Bergson, I don't think he even attempted to provide it in the form that would be expected today, with conceptual clarity, logical rigor, empirical adequacy, all this stuff that we talk about today. It was not the language of his time in the late 19th and very early 20th century. So he didn't do that. So we can't go as far as to say Bergson was an idealist. I don't think he had a system that was complete to any degree, to the degree that would be needed for us to use that word for him. But his thinking is seminal for modern idealism. That is for sure.
The word images came up, and just it reminded me. In one of your interviews, you mentioned the name of James Hillman, who has had a profound impact on my views since well, yeah, I've said that, like, 5 years ago, I could have summed up my philosophical and psychological insight in one sentence, that on the 7th of November you have to go to the parade, and that's it. That's the sort of upshot from my education from the Soviet times. That was the executive summary of my education in psychology and philosophy. So after that, Hillman has really been a great influence, and there is a I don't know if you have heard of it. It's like a 7-hour seminar on YouTube on Jung that I make an extensive notes on, and I just read from here that this is related to the images. That image is psyche. Jung's central position, says Hillman, image is psyche. Soul is not only expressed in images, but exists in them. How would you? I've written it down. It sounded important. I'm not quite sure that I'd like to unpack it with your help.
We can try to unpack it historically. The notion of the imagination as free and fundamental goes back almost as everything to the Indus Valley, to India, Pakistan. and the original Vedantic philosophy. So everything can be traced back to that. But in more modern times, in the beginning of Islam, particularly Shiite Islam, they developed what is probably the most criminally underrated philosophy in the history of the world, which is the philosophy of the imagination. You see that expressed in Sufism, but even outside of Sufism, Shiite Islam is characterized in its beginning by this idea that all the world an image, which is the title of a book by Cheetham, which is about the philosophy of the imagination. Jung was big on this, the notion that the psyche's fundamental expression is in the form of images. And when he says images, he doesn't mean only visual images. He's appealing to the imagination in general, our ability to form images, not only that are visual, but also other types of sensoria and even feelings and emotions, states that can be imagined, brought into existence through the endogenous activity of mind. Human, he met Jung late in Jung's life. Human was much younger than Jung. We know he met Jung 3 or 4 times. He was a student at the institute when Jung was still alive, even though he was not participating much in the institute anymore. And he ran with this notion of the key expression of the psyche being in the form of images, of imagination. And he poeticized it, which is a fair move, because when we are talking about images, we don't talk only about visual images. We talk about the entire emotional loading that is associated with the image and all the insights and evocations of meaning that accompany those images. And humans' archetypal psychology is basically a psychology of the imagination, which sort of links back all the way to early Shiite Islam, which is Islam, which is amazing how these things pop again and again in different times in different cultures. I would still consider Shiite Islam as the holders, the not only caretakers, they are more than that, but the root of that tree, if you know
Very
what I mean.
interesting. That's
And
most interesting.
the ones who are still nurturing it to this day, even though they're not talked about much, which I think is criminal, but that's how it is. Jung maybe tried to be more scientific in this position during his time. Human didn't have that. He got his PhD from the University of Zurich, which is, it's not a bad place to get a PhD from. He got it even summa cum laude, I think. Yeah, he did. He got it summa cum laude because of his book on, what was it, emotions, I think.
Yeah,
which was just before his book on suicide.
Yeah. Suicide as a...
Yeah. So he poeticized the whole of life. He was basically, he tried to provide a counterbalance to this cynical, not scientific, but scientific view of nature that we have today, which says that nature is something that is dead. It is intrinsically devoid of meaning, and meaning is an illusion that we project on nature. He tried to shift the pendulum radically to the other extreme in the hope that the pendulum would stop somewhere in the middle. So his extreme was, life is poetic. Life is the unfolding of a meaning-rich story. And that story is expressed in the form of images, not mathematical equations, not dead stuff obeying rules as if it were a mechanism. No, that's not it. That's not the world. That's not nature. That's not life. Life is the unfolding of the poetic imagination. And it's a book to be read, to be interpreted. It's a book to be allowed to touch you deep within, to convey emotion to you, to evoke emotion out of you. That's what it is about. And everything else is just a story. It's just theory. It's just abstraction. It's not real. What is real is the poetic imagination. That's life. That's what it's all about. Now, of course, truth is probably somewhere in the middle of these two things, because there are things about the world that are so incredibly predictable that it's hard to say they are not mechanical. The world doesn't seem to have the total freedom we associate with the poetic imagination. But does it have a lot of poetic imagination in it? Of course it does. One would need to be blind or very prejudiced to deny it.
Right. Well, you're approaching the last quarter of our hour.
Let's complete your questions. So if I have to stay a little longer, it's okay.
Okay. No, thank you. Thanks so much. The crown jewel of the Jung's legacy. I like that. I like that sentence as well. Let's jump into that now. The last chapters were just. I mean, I thoroughly enjoyed the book. It's just pulled so many the clarity and I think that's the clarity and that was very, very helpful, because Jung it's easy to get lost in
that is true. Well, I think different people have different opinions about what is the crown jewel of Jung's legacy. I think Jung himself had an opinion about it that I suspect is not far from my own. My opinion is that his crown jewel is a small little book, very easy to dismiss, called Answer to Job, which is a sort of a psychological analysis of both the book of Job in the Old Testament and the New Testament, and how God seems to undergo an amazing transformation between those two books. In the Old Testament, God makes a bet with Satan, who is not in hell. Satan is just a member of the entourage of God. Satan is basically the prosecutor in the court of God. He's not a sadist. He's not a bad guy. He's the doubter. He's the guy who puts a mirror in front of you when you're all filled with self-righteousness. And the devil is the guy who comes, puts a mirror in front of you and say, look, you are guilty of all this crap that you're accusing others of self-righteously. And that's why we hate the devil. And that's why we exiled the devil in hell, because we don't want to be confronted with our own dark side, our own contradictions, our own inability to see the bad in ourselves, our disposition to be judgmental of others. That's why we exile the devil. But in the Old Testament, the devil is not in exile yet. And God makes a bet with the devil to see whether the devil can prove that Job, a righteous man, very faithful, actually did all the good he did just to be on the good side of God and get rich. And God thinks, no, he's just righteous. And the devil says, no, he's doing that out of self-interest. In other words, he's a psychopath. He's trying to be on your good side, because then he has all those sheep and all those healthy kids that he has. And then Satan proceeds to torture Job over the longest of times, even though Job did nothing wrong. And Job confronts God with it and says, I'm a righteous man. I did nothing wrong. Why are you inflicting all this punishment on me? My children have died. I don't have my sheep anymore. I'm not healthy anymore. I'm poor. It's tragedy after tragedy. Why do I deserve this? And once he confronts God, God goes on a tirade saying, I am the power behind the storms. And he doesn't actually answer the question. He just goes on a tirade. And in that book, Jung basically analyzes Yahweh, the God of the Old Testament, and says he was incapable of self-reflection. As Jung put it, he was omniscient, but he didn't know how to consult his omniscience. The devil did, by any measure, better than God did. And therefore, there is a sense in which, in Jung's analysis, God sinned against Job. And to redeem that, in the New Testament, Job enters his own creation in the form of a man, of Jesus, and suffers like a man does, like Job did, and becomes the summum bonum, the total good. In other words, God becomes more conscious, more individuated in Jungian terminology. Of course, this is all metaphorical talk, using the metaphors of scripture. But for me, the jewel in Jung's legacy is one paragraph in answer to Job when he says, I will paraphrase it, I can't quote exactly. Moreover, it was not written in English, but he says something to this effect. Perhaps this is what man can contribute to God. The word man here is sexist, but I will stick to his style of back in the 50s. What man can contribute to God is that man is small in front of the monstrousness of the world. So he regularly is stopped on his feet because of his weakness. And he's forced to contemplate himself and contemplate the world and ask the deeper questions and become self-reflective and meta-conscious to, for instance, ponder the implications of his actions or the actions of nature, the actions of God, the actions of the world, and think through them deeply. And God doesn't need to do any of this because God is the Almighty. He is never stopped on his tracks and forced to self-reflect, forced to contemplate what's going on. So man is what enables the self-reflectiveness of God. It is through man's eyes that God becomes more conscious, more self-aware. And this, in religious metaphor, of course, this one paragraph single-handedly restores meaning to human life. Because now we are no longer rats in a cruel and pointless experiment by the divinity, which would be the case if God had all the answers. If God already knew everything, was completely conscious, why do we need to suffer? He already has all the answers. Why does he need us to learn something? What is this test that we are put through here? Like kids in school, the teacher already knows all the answers, and we are put in this just to suffer for no reason. It's a kind of sadistic game that has no meaning. But instead of thinking of ourselves as kids in school, think of ourselves as scientists in a laboratory who are performing leading edge research to learn things that God himself still doesn't know. And we have been deputized by God to help God become more conscious. Now, suddenly, all the suffering is couched in meaning. Yes, it's bad, will always be bad, but it is a tool towards insight. And the insights that we accumulate during our lives because we suffer are granted as gifts to God himself once we die. So one paragraph single-handedly restores meaning to life without departing from the Christian narrative and the Christian metaphors. I think that was astounding, an astonishing feat of the human intellect, a gigantic step, almost superhuman.
In that sense, he equates also, as I understand, he equates God with the collective unconscious. Is that how you?
Well, whatever answer I give you now, there will be Jungian scholars that will dispute it. And it comes back to that old discussion in Jungian psychology. What's the difference between God and the God image?
Yeah.
Did Jung talk about only the God image, or did he talk about God himself? I think towards the end of his life, Jung made clear that he was talking about God himself, not only the God image in the human psyche. Because an image must be imprinted by something. God is that something that imprints the God image in our psyche. So I think he did see God as the fountainhead of the collective unconscious, as that which expresses itself as the collective unconscious, and which appears to us as the colloquially physical world. Yeah. And he saw us essentially as diamonds of the collective unconscious. He talks about diamonds as semi-independent psychic complexes. And he never says, oh, we are diamonds too, but he comes so close to saying that you can smell that he intentionally implied it. And he wanted you as reader to be critical enough to understand that that's what he meant. So if we are diamonds of the collective unconscious that cease to be diamonds after we die, then our insights are again dispersed into the collective unconscious. And that's the mechanism for man's service to God, is to suffer through life in order to self-reflect and think. Because if we don't suffer, we don't think about the bigger questions. We just are busy with having fun. But if we suffer, we stop to think. We accumulate and develop, evolve insights during our lives, and those insights are an offering to God at the moment of death. Jung suggests this in multiple places, including his biography, Memory, Dreams, Reflections. Yeah.
All right, perhaps time the last two last questions. The term shadow didn't come up in the book, but it did come up in many interviews that I watched, and it was almost always coupled with the notion of adolescent Western culture. Could you just put these things somehow, kind of elaborate on these two
Sure.
key terms, shadow and adolescence of our Western culture?
Everyone always has a hidden side. We tend to favor the expression of certain ones of our own characteristics and repress the expression of others. Why do we make this choice? It may have to do with some intrinsic dispositions, but it also may have to do with the culture in which we grow up, the education we receive, the values of the society in which we live. So we favor certain characteristics that we have, and we allow them to express themselves, and we repress others. Often, we emphasize characteristics that our culture considers good, like our ability to work hard, our righteousness, our moral dispositions, and then we repress what society considers bad, but which are equally part of us, like our disposition to be angry, to inflict harm, to be dishonest, to betray. And all these things are archetypes. They in a higher or lower degree, they are present in all of us. Even betrayal. Hillman wrote an entire book about betrayal. Exactly at a moment in his life when his wife had betrayed him and he was betraying his wife. So it was very present in his mind at the time he wrote it. The shadow are these characteristics, these dispositions that we truly have, which we repress, which we try to not manifest, not even acknowledge to ourselves that we have them. And that's incredibly dangerous, because whatever we repress can now do its thing without adult supervision. Because what you repress, you're no longer looking at, you're no longer supervising, you're no longer paying attention to. You lock it behind the door, and now that thing is free to go on a rampage. It's free to grow, to simmer, to become stronger, embittered. And one day it breaks out the door and comes out totally out of control. And then you see that when you have, a righteous person who arrives at work every day at the right time, does all his tasks, is a good father to his family. And one day when he's 40, he picks up a rifle, goes to a shopping mall and kills 20 people. What do you think that is? That's a repressed shadow that was allowed to simmer without supervision, without a chance to express itself in safe ways so the pressure can be taken out. Now, it has been sitting in a pressure cooker for years, and one day it explodes. And that's the danger. We are very immature in the way we relate to our shadow. We think it's a moral value to not understand evil.
Yeah.
Literally.
Exactly the point Hillman makes.
Yeah. Yeah. We politicians can go up to a stage and say, full of pride, I cannot relate to evil. That is not in me. I just don't understand that. This is incredibly, one, immature, and two, dangerous. Because if you truly do not understand evil, you are going to be a victim of evil and an instrument of it, just like Hitler was, just like Putin is being right now. The greatest evil in the world today is incarnated in that one figure, Putin. Um, the mature way to relate to the shadow side is through adult supervision. The shadow has to be allowed some expression. It has to have its time under the sun. Otherwise, it simmers and builds up pressure. And one day it will backfire. It will come back to bite you. How can you express the shadow? Well, one, you have to be acquainted with it. You have to look in the mirror and be able to see it. For instance, I have a shadow of rage. I can become very angry in traffic when people do something they shouldn't do. I also can get very angry when things don't work as they should. I get very angry at low quality stuff, because I'm an engineer too. And when things don't work as they should, and I know there was no reason for it other than to be cheap, I get pretty angry. And I get angry in traffic. And you might say, well, how can you even call this dark shadow things? They're small and inconsequential. Everybody has that. Well, they are small and inconsequential because they are under adult supervision, because I recognize their existence in me, because I allow them to express themselves. For instance, I will punch a dust bag. If I'm pretty angry that there is, a phone that's not working as it should, I go punch the dirt bag. and I feed that expression. And you may say, oh, something so small and inconsequential. No, I feed it because that's my opportunity to let it out in a completely safe way with adult supervision, as opposed to getting out of my car and punching another driver in the face. It's much better to punch the dust bag, right? And to recognize that in oneself, it's a badge of maturity, even if our culture doesn't consider it to be a badge of honor. I think it's critically important that we understand not only the evil in, first and foremost, the evil in us. It's the only way to understand the evil in others is to first understand evil in from a first person perspective, directly, the evil in us. It's critical that we understand that, and then that we try to extrapolate that and understand the evil in others. To understand evil is not to agree with it, is not to succumb to it. It's precisely the contrary. To understand evil is a safeguard against succumbing to it. It's incredibly important to understand and be acquainted with the shadow. We need to understand why criminals do what they do. And the only way to understand that is to find the seed of that evil in ourselves. And for some reason, our culture has come to consider this shameful, that you can understand someone else's evil by looking at the seed of evil in yourself. We get spooked by it. We think, oh, that person then can be evil too. No, it's precisely the contrary. It's by understanding evil that you don't succumb to it and you don't become its tool. We have to be able, I'm very proud of understanding many forms of evil. There are a couple I still cannot understand, but I don't consider it a badge of honor. I'll be very honest with you. I don't understand adults who feel sexual attraction to kids. It's a room in the palace of mind I have tried to enter several times. I can't relate to it. because for me, it's the effect is precisely the opposite. You know, if I'm frisky and I don't want to be, think of a child and boom, no, it's gone. But I'm not proud of not understanding that, because clearly it's part of nature. Clearly people are born that way. And society has to safeguard its children from that, not by blaming those people, they are born that way, but by making sure they can't inflict harm. And to do that, you have to understand it. So I don't consider it a badge of honor that I can't relate to it. I hope that one day when I'm older and I've seen more of life and more of people, I hope I will at least have some inkling of where that is coming from. Yeah, that's my answer.
Thanks. It's just perhaps the very last, short last one. The afterword to your book is written by James Hollis, and you spoke very highly of him. I heard the name for the first time in one of the interviews. Could you just few remarks on him? I think that seems to be an important lead for me and for our readers.
I think he is, which adjective to use? He is the deepest living Jungian. He has the deepest insights, and he's probably one of the wisest men alive. Hollis is a wounded healer. Life has put him through unspeakable suffering. So he understands where people are. He understands suffering. He understands it very, very, very well. And he has found the strength in himself to perform the alchemical transformation from suffering to healing, to turn suffering into the ability to heal, especially men who go through midlife crisis. He has a couple of seminal books that speak to men during a midlife crisis.
Which one was you recommend?
I think it's Saturn's Shadow or Under the Shadow of Saturn. Well, you can just look up all his books are good. I have enormous respect for him.
Well, I cannot thank you enough just for this hour, and I told you a little bit of my story at the beginning, so. Yeah,